I didn't even feel it fall. I had no idea the one photograph I couldn't afford to lose was about to change a stranger's entire life. She only meant to find a name. What she found instead was a face she'd spent months looking for. One old photograph, a face she recognized instantly because it was her own mother's face, 30 years younger. One old photograph. For 3 seconds, the entire city seemed to go quiet around her. She wasn't chasing him down to return a wallet anymore. She was chasing down the only living connection to a sister she never knew she had. I have replayed the next 4 seconds of my life more times than I can count, and I still don't think I've fully made peace with how close I came to never noticing him at all. I was crossing 5th and Adler at exactly 12:14 on an ordinary Tuesday. Phone in one hand, coffee in the other, thinking about a lunch meeting I was already late for, when a brown leather wallet skittered off the curb near my feet, dropped by a man jogging a few steps ahead of me with a little girl's hand in his. The city was doing what it always does at that hour. A symphony of car horns and construction noise and someone's radio drifting out of a food truck window. The specific chaos of a downtown lunch rush that usually makes it easy to walk past almost anything without really seeing it. I almost let it go. I almost called out, "You dropped something," and kept walking. The way you do 100 times a year in a city this size. One more small kindness offered on autopilot and immediately forgotten. Instead, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I bent down, picked it up, and opened it looking for a name so I could catch up to him properly. The wallet landed just shy of a storm drain, close enough that another few inches might have sent it somewhere considerably harder to recover. Worn brown leather scuffed soft at the corners in the specific way a wallet gets after years of the same back pocket. And I remember noting, even before I opened it, that whoever it belonged to clearly wasn't the type to replace things just because they'd gotten old. What I found instead, tucked behind a faded grocery store loyalty card, was a small black and white photograph in a worn plastic sleeve. A young woman in clothes at least 30 years out of style, holding a newborn baby, smiling the specific, exhausted, radiant smile of someone meeting their child for the first time. I want to tell you, I recognized her immediately, but that's not quite true. What actually happened was stranger and slower than that. My body understood before my mind did, a cold drop in my stomach a full 2 seconds before I consciously registered that I was looking directly into my own mother's face, 30 years younger than I had ever seen her, holding a baby that was very clearly not me. But to understand exactly why a photograph belonging to a complete stranger stopped me cold in the middle of a crosswalk, you need to know what my mother told me on one of the last afternoons I ever spent with her. 5 months earlier, in a hospital room, neither of us wanted to admit she wasn't leaving. If you've ever wondered whether the truth has a way of finding you eventually, no matter how carefully it's been buried, stay with me until the end, because I got my answer on an ordinary sidewalk, and it changed the shape of my entire family. My name is Claire Ashford, and I run Ashford Publishing, a company my grandfather founded and my mother, Margaret, ran with a kind of elegant, unshakable composure for nearly 30 years before I took over 3 years ago. I grew up believing I understood my mother completely. The particular way she read every manuscript twice before approving it, the specific brand of loyalty she showed employees who'd been with the company since her own early years running it, the composed, faintly reserved warmth she extended to almost everyone except, very occasionally, herself. I remember, as a child, being fascinated by the framed black and white photograph of my grandfather that hung in my mother's office. The founder whose stern, ambitious face watched over every editorial meeting she ever ran. And I remember her telling me once, almost offhand, that running a company her father built meant carrying his expectations everywhere she went, a comment I filed away at the time as ordinary family pressure and only much later understood as something considerably heavier. She used to bring me to the office on snow days, set me up with a stack of manuscript pages and a red pencil, and let me pretend I was editing alongside her, a ritual I didn't realize until much later had probably been her own quiet way of trying to give me a version of childhood that included her, in the only language of attention she fully trusted herself to offer. I was an only child, raised in a beautiful house with a mother who worked constantly and loved fiercely in the specific, undemonstrative way of a woman who'd learned early that showing too much of yourself in public rarely ended well. I never once, growing up, sensed that she was carrying anything close to the size of the secret she eventually told me. My mother was diagnosed with a fast-moving illness the winter before last, and by early spring, the specialists had run out of options beyond making her comfortable. The specialists were careful, in the beginning, to talk in terms of treatment plans and percentages, the specific vocabulary hospitals use to soften a timeline nobody wants to say out loud. And I spent the first several weeks after her diagnosis genuinely believing, the way you do when the alternative is unthinkable, that we were simply managing a difficult chapter rather than approaching an ending. My mother, characteristically, adjusted to the reality of it faster than I did, handling her own mortality with the same composed efficiency she'd brought to every board meeting I'd ever watched her run, which somehow made the whole thing both easier and considerably more heartbreaking to witness up close. I spent as many afternoons as I could manage at her bedside during those final months, mostly talking about nothing in particular, the way you do when you're both quietly avoiding the actual subject neither of you wants to name out loud. It was on one of those afternoons, with late afternoon light slanting through the hospital window and neither of us pretending anymore that this was a temporary situation, that she asked me to close the door and told me something she said she'd carried for 34 years without telling a single living soul, including my father. "I need you to just listen," she said, before I'd even fully closed the door, her voice steadier than I expected given how her hands were shaking against the blanket. "I have spent 34 years deciding I would take this to my grave, and I have changed my mind exactly once, which is right now, so please don't make me lose my nerve by asking questions until I've finished." I sat very still and let her talk, watching a version of my mother I had genuinely never seen before. Not composed, not reserved, just a 19-year-old girl's fear finally breaking the surface of a 71-year-old woman's face. She told me about my grandparents' reaction, about being sent to stay with a distant cousin for the final months so the neighbors wouldn't ask questions about signing papers in a small office. She said she could still describe in exact detail, even 34 years later, down to the specific pattern of the wallpaper. Before she married my father, before Ashford Publishing had ever become her life's work, my mother had been 19 years old and unmarried when she found out she was pregnant, the result of a relationship her own parents considered, in her words, entirely unsuitable for a family with their particular expectations about respectability. Under pressure, I don't think she ever fully forgave them for, and in an era and a family where the alternative felt genuinely unthinkable to her, she gave birth quietly, away from home, and placed the baby, a daughter, for adoption through a private agency, then returned to her life and never spoke of it again to anyone, not even, eventually, to herself in any way she allowed herself to fully feel. She married my father 4 years later. She had me 8 years after that. And she told me, gripping my hand hard enough to leave marks, that not knowing what had become of that daughter, whether she'd been loved, whether she was even still alive, was the one regret she had never once, in 34 years, managed to set down. I asked her, once I could speak again, whether she had anything a name, a date, an agency, anything at all that might help find her. She had almost nothing. The adoption had been arranged privately and deliberately vaguely, structured specifically so that neither party could easily locate the other later, a common practice in that era for exactly the kind of situation my mother had been in. She remembered the agency's name, a small operation called Willow Creek Adoption Services that she believed had closed decades ago, and she remembered the exact date because it was also, unbearably, my half-sister's birthday. That was all she had to give me, and 2 weeks later she was gone, leaving me with a promise I'd made at her bedside to at least try, even though every reasonable part of me expected the search to end in nothing at all. The 2 weeks between my mother's funeral and the day I finally called Thomas Reyes were mostly a blur of sympathy casseroles and condolence cards I couldn't quite bring myself to read carefully. But somewhere in that fog, the promise I'd made at her bedside kept surfacing, insistent enough that ignoring it eventually felt harder than acting on it. I hired Thomas, a genealogist and records researcher, almost immediately after the funeral, mostly because sitting with the promise unfulfilled felt worse than facing the likely disappointment of failure. Thomas was thorough and honest with me from the start about the odds. Willow Creek Adoption Services had indeed closed in the late 1990s, its physical records scattered across at least 2 subsequent record-keeping transfers, some of it digitized, much of it not, and closed adoptions from that era were notoriously difficult to trace without a name, a location, or cooperation from the other party. Thomas would call every few weeks with an update that amounted, more often than not, to a longer list of doors that had turned out to be closed. A woman in the state records office who thought she remembered the agency's name but couldn't locate any surviving intake ledgers. A microfiche archive that had apparently been damaged in a flood sometime in the early 2000s, taking an unknown percentage of exactly the kind of paperwork we needed with it. A retired social worker who might have worked adjacent to Willow Creek decades earlier, but had since passed away herself, any personal records she might have kept lost along with her. Each update chipped away a little more at the cautious hope I was trying not to let myself feel too strongly, until by month 4 I'd started drafting in my head the version of this story where I simply never found her, and had to learn to live with that instead. I'd left the office later than planned that particular Tuesday, delayed by a call with our printing vendor that ran 20 minutes over, which meant I was walking faster than usual, distracted, running the numbers for an acquisitions meeting in my head instead of paying any real attention to the sidewalk in front of me, the specific, ordinary kind of distraction that makes it easy, in hindsight, to understand exactly how close I came to walking right past the one thing that would end up mattering more than the entire meeting I was rushing toward. I didn't know, obviously, on that ordinary Tuesday crossing 5th and Adler, that the door was about to open itself, dropped directly at my feet by a stranger jogging to catch a crosswalk signal with his daughter's hand in his. His name, I learned once I caught up to him half a block later, waving the wallet, and more urgently the photograph itself, was Owen Callahan. "Wait, this is yours," I called out, weaving between 2 women with strollers to close the distance, and Owen turned with the specific, instinctive alarm of a parent whose hand had just registered his daughter's grip tightening at a stranger's raised voice, relaxing only once he saw the wallet held out in my hand rather than anything resembling a threat. The confusion on his face when I asked him, breathless and probably alarming, where the photograph had come from, was entirely understandable, given how the question must have sounded coming from a stranger in a business suit who'd just chased him down a city sidewalk. "That photo isn't for sale if that's what," he started, misreading my urgency as some kind of odd solicitation, before I cut in, more gently, to explain that I wasn't trying to buy anything from him, only trying to understand where a photograph of a woman I was fairly certain was my own mother had ended up in his wallet. He told me, carefully, watching my face for some explanation of why I was asking, that the photograph belonged to his late wife, Nora, that it was the only image she'd ever had of her own birth mother, included in her adoption paperwork decades earlier, and that he'd carried it in his wallet since she passed away 4 years ago, partly to keep a piece of her close, and partly because their daughter, Maddie, liked to look at it sometimes when she wanted to feel connected to a grandmother she'd never met. I asked him, my voice not entirely steady, whether he knew the name of the adoption agency. He said he did, actually, because Nora had mentioned it more times than he could count over the years she'd spent, on and off, wondering about her own origins. Willow Creek Adoption Services. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said that name, because the entire street seemed to tilt very slightly, the specific vertigo of a coincidence too large and too precise to actually be a coincidence at all. We ended up at a small coffee shop half a block from where we'd met, Maddie occupying herself with a children's menu and a box of crayons, while Owen and I tried cautiously and with the particular carefulness of two people afraid of being wrong about something enormous, to piece together whether what we were both thinking could possibly be true. "I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound strange," I said, once Maddie was settled with her crayons. "Where exactly was your wife born?" Owen gave me the name of the hospital without hesitation, the specific way people do when a fact has been repeated often enough in their family to become reflexive. And I felt my pulse pick up before he'd even finished the sentence, because it was the same hospital my mother had named at her bedside, the only physical detail she'd been certain enough of to share. Owen told me about Nora, that she'd been adopted as an infant by two loving parents who'd raised her with total devotion but had always been honest with her, from a young age, about being adopted, which had given her both a stable childhood and a lifelong, quiet curiosity about the woman who'd given birth to her. "I met Nora at a mutual friend's barbecue the summer after we'd both finished graduate school," Owen told me, and what he remembered most clearly from that first conversation wasn't anything she'd said about herself directly, but the specific, careful way she talked about her adoptive parents, with a kind of fierce, protective gratitude that made it obvious, before she'd even used the word adopted, that she'd grown up deeply loved and equally aware that love and biology don't automatically answer every question a person carries about where they come from. She'd told him, on maybe their third date, that her parents had never once hidden her adoption from her, had in fact celebrated it openly for as long as she could remember, which she said had given her the freedom to be curious about her birth family without it ever feeling like a betrayal of the family who'd actually raised her. She'd tried twice, over the years Owen knew her, to formally request more information through whatever channels still existed for Willow Creek's dissolved records, both times receiving the same polite, bureaucratic dead-end record sealed, agency defunct, no legal pathway forward without cooperation from a birth parent who had never, as far as anyone could tell, come looking from the other direction. She'd stopped actively searching sometime in her late 20s, she'd told Owen once, not because she'd stopped wondering, but because she'd decided, with the same quiet resolve she brought to most hard things, that peace mattered more than an answer she might never get, and that the photograph at least was proof her birth mother had wanted her, however briefly, however the story had ended after that. The illness that took Nora moved faster than any of the doctors initially expected, and in her final weeks when Maddie was too young to fully understand what was happening, Nora spent a surprising amount of her remaining energy making sure the photograph would stay with their daughter specifically, instructing Owen, more than once, that Maddie should grow up knowing her grandmother's face existed somewhere in the world, even if none of them ever learned her name. He'd carried it in his wallet every day since the funeral, partly for Maddie's sake and partly, he admitted to me later, for his own, a small private ritual of keeping a door open that Nora herself had eventually made peace with closing. I told him about my mother, about the hospital room and the 34-year secret and the promise I'd made at her bedside, and I watched something shift in his face as I spoke. The particular recognition of someone realizing that a private grief he'd assumed was entirely his own might actually be tangled up with someone else's. Nora, he told me, had been born in this same city, at the hospital Willow Creek had partnered with for private placements, on a date that, once he said it out loud, matched exactly the birthday my mother had given me at her bedside. Neither of us said the actual word out loud for a long moment. I think we both understood, sitting in that coffee shop with a 7-year-old carefully coloring a dinosaur menu between us, that we were circling something too large to name carelessly, something that deserved to be confirmed properly rather than simply assumed because two grieving people badly wanted it to be true. I asked Owen if he'd be willing to work with Thomas, my genealogist, to see whether we could actually confirm it, and he agreed without much hesitation, telling me, with a small, sad smile, that Nora had spent her whole life wanting exactly this kind of answer, and that finishing her search for her, even after she was gone, felt like something he owed her regardless of how it turned out. Thomas, when I called him that evening, was more cautious than I wanted him to be, reminding me gently that coincidences involving dates and cities happen more often than people expect, and that we owed it to everyone involved, including a 7-year-old who deserved better than false hope, to treat this as a lead worth investigating properly rather than a conclusion already reached. I appreciated his caution even as it frustrated me, mostly because I recognized, uncomfortably, that I'd have wanted exactly that same rigor from him 5 months earlier, before I had a specific reason to want him to move faster. Thomas worked fast once he had an actual name and date to anchor the search instead of guesswork. He spent the better part of a week working through a records warehouse 2 states over that housed what remained of several defunct adoption agencies' physical files, a process that involved, as he described it to me with visible exhaustion during one late-night phone call, several hundred boxes organized by a filing system that had apparently made sense to exactly one records clerk sometime in 1994 and to nobody since. The partial intake file he eventually found had water damage along one entire edge, rendering several lines illegible. But the surviving fragment included a mother's initials, an approximate birth date, and a hospital name that all lined up independently with what both my mother and Owen had separately told us. It wasn't on its own conclusive proof, but it was enough of a match that Owen and I both agreed the only responsible next step was a DNA test, the specific kind of caution I think we both needed, because some truths are too important to build on hope alone. The 6 weeks we waited for those results were some of the strangest of my adult life, filled with a specific, suspended kind of hoping I didn't entirely trust myself to feel, because I'd already learned, over 5 months of dead ends, exactly how badly wanting something to be true can distort your judgment about whether it actually is. Owen and I talked on the phone more than either of us probably expected to during that stretch, mostly logistics at first, then gradually more Maddie's dinosaur obsession, my mother's actual laugh instead of the composed public version most people knew. Small, ordinary details neither of us had any particular reason to share except that we'd both, quietly, started looking forward to the calls. Some nights the calls ran long past when either of us had actual reason to still be talking, drifting from logistics into the kind of easy, meandering conversation that only happens between 2 people who've stopped performing for each other. And I remember hanging up one particularly late call and sitting in my dark living room for a while afterward, turning over the strange, quiet realization that I was looking forward to the next one considerably more than the outcome of the test itself. I found myself, during those 6 weeks, doing something I hadn't done in years, which was reading Ashford Publishing's own backlist of family memoirs during my lunch breaks instead of manuscript submissions, searching, I think, for some kind of language other people had already found for exactly the specific suspended grief of waiting to learn whether the family you thought you understood was actually considerably larger than you'd known. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon, and I read them alone in my office 3 times before I trusted myself to call Owen, because the number on the page, a confidence level well beyond any reasonable margin for coincidence, confirmed what we'd both suspected but hadn't allowed ourselves to fully believe. "Are you sitting down?" I asked him, which in hindsight was probably an unnecessary dramatic thing to say over the phone, but I genuinely didn't trust my own voice to deliver the number without some kind of warning first. He was quiet long enough that I asked if he was still there, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before, telling me that he needed a minute, and that he wanted to go find Maddie's photo of Nora before I said anything else, because he wanted to be looking at his wife's face when he finally heard the actual answer she'd spent her whole life wondering about. Nora Callahan, born 38 years earlier and given up through Willow Creek Adoption Services on the exact date my mother had given me, was my mother's daughter, my half-sister. A woman I would now never get to meet, who had spent her entire life wondering about a woman who had, in her own quiet, complicated way, spent decades wondering right back. I cried harder reading that confirmation than I had at my mother's funeral, which surprised me until I understood why. Grief for my mother had at least come with the comfort of 34 years of memories to hold on to. Grief for Nora came with nothing but absence, An entire sister-shaped life I would never get to know anything about except secondhand through a widower and a 7-year-old and a single worn photograph. Thomas told me, once the DNA results confirmed what we'd all been hoping for, that in 15 years of this work, cases that actually resolved happily were rarer than people assumed, and that he intended to frame his invoice from this particular case, a joke that only half concealed how genuinely invested he'd become in an outcome that, professionally speaking, wasn't supposed to matter to him personally at all. When I called Owen, he was quiet for a long moment after I told him, and then he said something I've held on to since, that Nora had spent her whole life feeling like a question mark hung over one entire half of her identity, and that even though she wasn't here to hear the answer, some part of him needed to believe that finally having one, even posthumously, meant something real. Meeting Maddie properly, once she understood, in the careful terms Owen and I worked out together beforehand, that I was her mother's sister, was one of the strangest and most tender experiences of my life. We met at a small park near her school 2 weekends later, Owen having gently prepared her over the preceding days with a version of the story simplified for a 7-year-old, that her mommy had a sister she never got to meet, and that the sister was me, and that I was very happy to have found her even though it had taken a long time. Maddie spent the first 10 minutes of our meeting studying me with unblinking seriousness from a safe distance near the swings, and I remember being genuinely nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in a boardroom in years, before she finally walked over, held up a plastic dinosaur and asked, without any preamble at all, whether I knew that a Therizinosaurus had claws longer than a grown man's arm, a fact I confirmed I did not previously know and needed to hear more about immediately. She looked at me for a long moment with the serious assessing look children give adults when they're deciding how a new piece of information fits into their understanding of the world, and then asked with total sincerity whether that meant I was her aunt. Now I told her it absolutely did. She considered this for another moment, and then asked whether aunts were required to like dinosaurs, which I confirmed, with equal seriousness, was in fact a core requirement of the role, and watched her entire face light up in a way that undid something in my chest I hadn't realized was still braced tight. Maddie, in the weeks that followed, started asking Owen more questions about her mother than she had in over a year, prompted, I think, by the sudden tangible sense that her mother's story hadn't actually ended where she'd always assumed it had, and Owen told me, with something between exhaustion and gratitude, that answering those questions had turned out to be some of the best evenings the two of them had spent together since the funeral. Going through my mother's private papers in the weeks that followed, mostly out of a need to understand her more fully. Now that I finally had context for the parts of her I'd never understood, I found something that changed the shape of my grief all over again. Tucked inside a folder of old financial records was a decades-long pattern of anonymous donations, modest but consistent, made every single year to a small nonprofit that had absorbed Willow Creek's charitable mission after it closed. An organization that helped fund post-adoption search services for both birth parents and adoptees. My mother had never pursued her own daughter directly, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear, perhaps simply because she genuinely believed, the way people of her generation and circumstances often did, that reopening the door herself would only cause more harm. But she had spent over 30 years quietly funding exactly the kind of resource that might one day help someone else's daughter find her way home. A silent, sideways hope she never spoke aloud to a single person, including me. I sat on my mother's office floor for a long time after finding that ledger, surrounded by 30 years of quiet, unglamorous receipts, understanding for the first time that grief and love had apparently been sharing the exact same space inside her for over 3 decades, hidden in plain sight in a filing cabinet nobody had ever thought to ask about. I shared that discovery with Owen over dinner one evening, the two of us and Maddie at my dining room table, for what had, by then, become something close to a weekly habit, and I watched him absorb it with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything that mattered. She never stopped looking for her, in her own way, he said quietly, And I told him I thought that was exactly right, and that some part of me found real peace in understanding that my mother's silence had never actually been indifference, only fear dressed up as composure for 34 years, right up until she finally found the courage to hand the truth to me instead of carrying it all the way to the end alone. I told my father about all of this several weeks after the DNA results came back, uncertain how he'd react to learning, decades into his marriage, that my mother had carried a secret this large for the entirety of their life together. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then told me, to my genuine surprise, that he'd always suspected there was something from her early life she'd never fully shared with him, some careful boundary he'd learned early in their marriage not to push against, and that knowing the actual shape of it now, however late, made him feel closer to her rather than further away. Owen and Maddie have become, in the months since that Tuesday sidewalk collision of ours, something closer to family than I ever expected a stranger's dropped wallet to produce. We settled, over the following months, into a rhythm neither of us had planned but both seemed to need. Sunday dinners at my apartment that started out careful and gradually became genuinely easy. Maddie's artwork slowly colonizing my refrigerator door, the way it had apparently colonized every surface of Owen's kitchen for years. A standing invitation for Owen to bring grading to my dining table on evenings he needed company more than silence. Maddie has a standing invitation to my office on days Owen has parent-teacher conferences, where she's taught my entire executive assistant staff considerably more about dinosaurs than any of us knew we needed. My assistant once asked, only half joking, whether I was adopting a family, and I told her, honestly, that it felt less like adopting one and more like finally being let into one that had, in some strange and roundabout way, been waiting for me all along. I established, that spring, a modest annual grant through Ashford Publishing's charitable arm, funding exactly the kind of post-adoption search resources my mother had quietly supported for 30 years without ever telling anyone, formalizing in public what she'd only ever been brave enough to do in private. Owen helped me choose the name for it, suggesting, after a long evening of discarded options, that we call it simply the Nora Fund, because his late wife, more than anyone else in this entire story, was the person whose lifelong question had finally, however circuitously, gotten answered. I've started keeping the photograph myself now, in a proper frame instead of a cracked plastic sleeve, on the shelf in my office where I can see it during long days, a young woman I never met, holding a daughter she never got to raise, connected to me by a sister I never got to know, and a mother I thought I understood completely and, it turns out, barely knew at all. Owen keeps a photo of my mother now too, a more recent one I gave him from her final years running the company, so that Maddie can eventually understand both halves of the family she comes from, the grandmother who raised her mother's memory in secret for 30 years, and the parents who raised her mother in the open with nothing but honesty. Two very different kinds of love that somehow, against considerable odds, found their way to the same little girl in the end. I think about that crosswalk often, mostly because of how easily none of it could have happened. A wallet that stays in a pocket, a photograph tucked one page deeper where I wouldn't have noticed it, a lunch meeting I actually made on time instead of pausing to bend down for a stranger's dropped belongings. Instead, I stopped, and a door that had stayed sealed for 34 years finally opened. Not because anyone went looking for the answer in the right file cabinet, but because two grieving families happened to cross paths on an ordinary sidewalk at exactly the right careless, unremarkable second. I don't think my mother would have called that a coincidence. I think, knowing her the way I finally understand her now, she would have called it the last quiet thing she ever managed to do for the daughter she never stopped hoping would somehow, someday, find her way back around. Maddie still keeps the original photograph in a small frame beside her bed now, a copy of the one I keep in my office, and she likes to tell people, with total unself-conscious confidence, that she has an aunt who runs a company and a grandmother she never met who loved her before she was even born, a sentence that would have taken me, a year ago, considerably longer to untangle than it apparently takes a 7-year-old to simply accept as fact.